Neil, I mean, it actually makes me quite emotional seeing that. God bless the Chinese people. They are all putting their lives on the line to stand up against zero COVID. What do you make of it?
It's definitely extraordinarily brave because we all know that, the track record of brutal oppression and violent suppression of protests that China's capable of, back to Tiananmen Square in '89. But there's plenty of people saying, wiser heads than mine, saying that the protests in China now are different. That it's a grassroots rebellion, and that it's not just isolated in one place, as in the case of Tiananmen Square, but it's kind of metastasized right through the country. It's all over the place, and that it poses a genuine threat. There's people saying it poses a genuine threat. I'm reminded of, we've had Maya Touzi on my show on a Saturday night a couple of times talking about what's happening in Iran. And he's saying that where there have been protests in Iran before, that they're different now, that this grassroots rebellion has all of the potential to seriously provoke regime change. And there are protests all over the world at the moment, in South America, in Brazil, in all across Europe, although we don't actually see much coverage of the protests, and I think there are reasons why we don't see a great deal of coverage of protests in Holland and protests elsewhere by farmers.
I wanted to ask you about that, Neil, because while I absolutely salute the Chinese people, as you know, I'm so with them, and I want this to become the biggest story in the world. I believe it deserves to be. There is quite an irony, isn't there, Neil, about the fact that the BBC, Sky News, CNN, Channel 4 News, all of the usual suspects, all of a sudden consider protests against authoritarian COVID laws and the concept of zero COVID, that they consider that news, because, Neil, it has been going on for years and they never considered it news up until now.
I think there's a lot of scuttling about trying to adopt the right position on protest at the moment, and I think some of them are confused about exactly what they should be doing to be seen by the public to be doing the right thing. But you're absolutely right. The media here, for example, were so savage about people protesting about lockdown. Mm-hmm. The front pages of newspapers, the coverage on the terrestrial news, it was savage about granny killers and COVIDiots,
conspiracy theorists, and
the anti-vax and every pejorative that they could think that they could get away with were heaped upon it. And they were speculating about whether our lockdown protesters should be locked in their homes, should be driven from polite society, and all of the rest of it. And then, fast forward to where we are now, and they've got the audacity, the temerity to write leader columns and front page stories about the bravery of the Chinese people. Now, nobody's denying the bravery of the Chinese people, but the fact that so many commentators here, who a few months ago were savagely putting down, in metaphorical sense, protest here, are now lionising and hero worshipping the protesters in China is just hypocrisy. And I would say definitely that this should be a wake-up call for anybody who's still not paying attention.
It does, Neil. Wake-up call is the word, indeed. Neil Oliver, back on GB News, 6 o'clock.